In this video, I want to share with you how my thoughts, my perspectives have changed when it comes to Israel, Gaza, Palestine over a long period, actually. Now, before I became a Muslim, I was a committed Christian. I wasn't a cultural Christian. I hadn't been brought up as one. I was a born again, committed, conservative Christian, first an evangelical, and then the last couple of years before my conversion to Islam, I was a Catholic. I was at university at the time, and I discovered the glories of Catholicism, and I decided to embrace the Church of the creeds and the councils and tradition and monasticism and the saints and all that stuff. I thought it was great, so I converted to Catholicism towards the end. But during that entire time, I don't think I ever thought of Palestine or really of Israel. I became increasingly Islamophobic, it's true, but I never really understood what was going on in the Middle East at all, really. I never really gave it much thought, perhaps except from time to time what was reported in the Western media. So I certainly wasn't pro-Palestine. I had no understanding of the history of Zionism or anything like that. And then when I embraced Islam, I was very conscious of not just embracing an idea, a theology, the belief in the oneness of God, Tawheed, and that the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, is the last messenger and prophet sent to the whole of mankind. I accepted that, but also something else significant happened to me, and that was I crossed over a civilizational line, a divide, an invisible line. And I moved from in Britain from the dominant white Western middle class constituency over and identified, and I found myself looking at the world from a different place. I suddenly, in identifying with Muslims, obviously, and the Ummah, I started to perceive the whole of the world differently from the position of the Muslims themselves, who are predominantly, of course, in the global south. And I became aware for the first time of the history of the Palestinians and their country and their traditions and their struggle for freedom and against occupation, against the British, of course, who occupied, and then against the Zionists later. And so in crossing over that line, I left the Western commitment and unreserved, unqualified support for the state of Israel, and I suddenly saw the position of the Palestinians, who are being dispossessed of their land, and terribly in the recent year that they have been subject to attempts at genocide, and we can all see this on social media. For the first time in history, we can now see this for ourselves every day, and it's shocking beyond words. So there was that. So there were two stages. The first stage as a Christian, I really had no awareness of what was going on. The second stage, as a new Muslim, seeing the world from a different point of view, from the view of the people who were oppressed, who were suffering, as opposed to those who were dominant and doing all the things that we have seen. And then about a year ago, particularly after October the 11th, there was a third stage in my awareness of what's going on. And this was a much more troubling, or even more troubling awareness, and that is the nature of the West itself. The West passionately says it believes, and I think at some level it does believe, sincerely, perhaps, in freedom, the rule of international law, individual rights, freedom from oppression, believes in tolerance, self-determination, sovereignty. I think at some level it actually believes what it says about these things. And my awareness about a year ago was, of course, that this is largely words, or at best it's extremely selectively applied in the international arena with our friends and allies. Of course, we support them unreservedly, no matter what they do. We give them diplomatic, military cover if they commit war crimes, if they break international law, if they commit atrocities and genocide. We will give them cover even though we believe in the international rule of law and so on. And though we believe in free speech, we will actively seek to repress pro-Palestinian sentiments and demonize such legitimate protests as anti-Semitic and so on. We see this in American universities, we see this in Germany and other places in the so-called Free West. But it went deeper than that. It was an awareness for me, which I hadn't, to be honest, I hadn't really grasped before, being a white guy, you know, privileged and all that. I hadn't grasped really that the West is supremacist and deeply racist. And I don't mean the individual Westerners are racist in that kind of crude way, although some may be. That's not what I mean. I mean the whole of the civilization believes itself to be superior to other civilizations, particularly Arabic culture, Muslim civilizations, that history and so on. It believes it is right to be dominant. It feels it's exceptional in some way and has a right to intervene around the world, like the world's policeman. You know, the White House often speaks like this. Whoever the president is, they have this exceptionalist mentality. They have a right to rule over others. No one elected them to do this. No one consented. No one appointed them to do this. But they appoint themselves to do this. And because they have power to do so, they get away with it, literally. And so might equals right. This is the real creed just under the surface in the West. Because we have power, therefore we are right to exercise it over others without their consent. Now, this is not democracy, of course. It's not tolerance. It's not freedom. It's just raw dominance. And with that, as I say, goes a sense of supremacism, white supremacism, superiority, hegemony over the world. And that's exercised not just militarily, but economically and culturally and so on and so on. We all know this. And it was the realization of this asymmetrical power relationship between the West and the rest that really came home to me once Israel started to begin its genocidal campaign, and the West's reaction in the media and the governments to this and supporting it. Liberals, people on the left even, Labour Party here in Britain, very much supporting Israel's right to cut off food, water, supplies, everything to the Palestinians. And they were very open about this. And this shocked me. It shocked all of us, of course. So a lot of the rhetoric of the left traditionally about imperialism, about the West, is true, actually, although I'm of the left and of the right. I kind of don't fit in a category, but it's true, and it was a great moment of unveiling for me. It wasn't just about the particular historical situation of the Palestinians and their struggle against occupation. It was the West's own supremacist, racist, white supremacist attitude to the others and how it permeates virtually everything we do, and that was quite a shocking realization. I know for many people this is obvious, and I'm late at the game, and better late than never, I suppose. But the creed of the West is might equals right, in my view, and that's straight from the pages of Machiavelli, who wrote *The Prince*. Is an Italian writer in the Renaissance, who wrote this kind of extraordinary book about how rulers can attain power, and once they get it, keep it by fair means or foul. It was amoral, but it was all about how really to exercise and keep power in the world. And that's what the West is really about, looking after its own interests first. And if that means the killing of countless numbers of non-Westerners, non-white people, so be it. And at the same time, at the other corner of its mouth, it will say, we believe in human rights and freedom. We get this from America all the time, and Britain and so on. We uphold international law. But of course, the whole world can see the hypocrisy and the double standards. It's so blatant. It doesn't need to be argued for. It's obvious. We don't need to argue for it, really, particularly when the situation in Ukraine gets factored in as a comparison. So how do we view the Ukrainians in being occupied by the Russians and our support for them versus the the situation of the Palestinians. So I've gone through those three stages, and each is very troubling, and that's where we are today. And because in the West we are hampered by various very strict laws about what we can say and can't say, just not only on YouTube, but also in the West. So one's limited what one can say about the struggle. But what I will do is share again some words from Guy Eaton, the amazing English Muslim writer. He worked as a consultant at Regent's Park Mosque, where I go here in London. And he was a Muslim for many, many years before he died in his 80s. And he died, I don't know, over 10 years ago now. But his book, Islam and the Destiny of Man, I'm constantly flogging it. If you haven't got it, I do recommend it. It's great for non-Muslims as well as for Muslims who want to have a richer understanding of their faith. And this book was actually the second edition. The last was published in 1994. And he wrote some words about Palestine, which could have been written today. And they're so fresh and vivid and insightful. I want to share them with you. Some of the things he says are dated, though, and it'd be obvious when he says something that's dated. But the overall commentary on Muslims and Israel and the Palestine question is still very shockingly relevant, and just shows how little has changed, and in fact how things have got worse actually than when he wrote, obviously. So he wrote on page 36, the Palestine question is so fraught with emotion that one would be glad to escape the necessity of mentioning it. Necessity, however, cannot be escaped, and the existence of the state of Israel in Palestine, the first territory beyond the Arabian Peninsula to be conquered by Islam, is the key to the political orientation of the vast majority of educated Muslims in our time, the cause of most of the troubles which have afflicted the Arab world over the past 45 years, and a constant factor of instability in the Middle East. The United States and the European community might be less inclined to indulge in wishful thinking on this issue if they understood a little more about the Muslim perspective. And now, by the way, I think they do understand the Muslim perspective. They don't want to accept it, they reject it, and they have another perspective. It's not that they just don't listen. They know, but they reject it. In the first place, Guy Eaton says, Muslims do not in general share the Occidental obsession with race. Europeans and their American cousins, even when they are quite free from any hostile prejudice, automatically identify people in terms of their racial origin. It's an important insight into the Western mentality here. The Muslim, on the other hand, identifies and judges a man or woman primarily in terms of their religion. A Jew is a faithful adherent of Judaism, just as a Muslim is an adherent of Islam, even if his grandfather happened to be a Jewish rabbi, as was the case with the eminent contemporary writer and scholar, the late Muhammad Asad. As it happens, a surprisingly high proportion of European and American converts to Islam over recent years have been of Jewish origin, no doubt on account of the strong affinities between these two religious perspectives. So this is a key point here. And if you don't know this already, that Westerners, whatever really their political ideology, do tend to identify people by their race. And this is the default position. Whether or not they say it openly, this is the case. Actually, Islamically, of course, it's not like that. People identified by something much more profound, their religion. Their religion. What the West sees in Israel is the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish race. When I do that, that's because it's in commas in the book. Just recompense for centuries of persecution at the hands of Europeans. Whether or not the citizens of the new state happen to be individually religious seems quite irrelevant. The Nazis did not inquire into a man's piety before sending him to the gas chamber. What the Muslim sees in Israel is European and American settlers established in a Muslim country with the support of the former imperial powers and maintained there by American arms. I mean, that's such a succinct sentence that gets it in one. It's a settler colonial project. A secular Jew is, for him, a contradiction in terms. You can get Jewish atheists now, so there's a contradiction. So far as he can judge, most Israelis, particularly those in the ruling group, are not Jews at all. They look like Europeans, they talk like Europeans, they think like Europeans, and, most important of all, they exhibit precisely those characteristics of aggressiveness and administrative efficiency which the Muslim associates with European imperialism. Again, another profound insight. It's not just a settler colonial project in the Muslim world. This is characteristic of European imperialism. And then there's a footnote here at the bottom. It's true that the Oriental Jews, the Sephardim, now outnumber the Westerners, the Ashkenazim, in Israel, and are beginning to exercise decisive influence on government. But in politics, appearances are more important than facts. The impression that Israel is a Western colonial enclave is reinforced by public attitudes in America and Europe. It is interesting, for example, to note that Israel has been the only non-European country to participate in the annual Eurovision Song Contest, watched by an estimated 500 million viewers, yet no one finds this peculiar, he says. The parallel with the Crusades is painfully obvious, he writes. Westerners have again come to Palestine. They again occupy the holy city of Quds, Jerusalem. The misfortunes of the Jews as a race, the pogroms and the Holocaust itself, was certainly not the fault of the Muslims. Europe's guilt is Europe's business, and they do not see why they should be expected to suffer for it. This is a sentiment I've heard often expressed. Europe's guilt, its historical guilt, is Europe's business. Muslims didn't commit any crimes, and they do not see why they should be expected to suffer for it. Why do you not give the Jews some of the choicest lands of Germany? King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud asked President Roosevelt. He might well have suggested, no less reasonably but no more profitably, that the Americans, if they felt so strongly on the subject, could quite well spare one of their own 48 states, Texas perhaps, as a home for the Jews. In fact, there are 50 states. I don't know why Guy Eaton thinks there are 48. As a home for the Jews. The white man, as the Arabs see it, is more inclined to give away other people's territory than his own. Many Muslims are convinced that Western support for Israel can be ascribed quite simply to hypocrisy. When he says many Muslims, this is wrong. It's all Muslims. And these days, this is so important. There has been a great extension of understanding on this issue way beyond Muslims now. You get young people in obscure villages, obscure towns in America, TikToking about this. People are not Muslims all over the place. The world is waking up in a new way to what is going on. Many people, perhaps most people on the planet now, understand the hypocrisy of this. It's not just many Muslims, it's all Muslims and most other people now, I think. They believe that Europe and the United States created Israel as a means of ridding themselves of their Jewish populations. So he's arguing here something that's actually quite profound, interesting point, that the original motive, perhaps under the Balfour Declaration and others, was actually for Britain to rid itself of its Jews. And some Jews, even in the cabinet at that time, in the UK cabinet, as a Jew who was a member of the British cabinet at that time in 1917, said, look, this is just an excuse, the Balfour Declaration, about creating a homeland in Palestine. It's a means of the UK and others to rid themselves of their Jewish populations. So it was seen as anti-Semitic, the Balfour Declaration, by Jews, some Jews. However absurd this accusation may seem to Europeans and Americans, the fact remains that Zionism arose as a reaction to anti-Semitism and, in the view of its founders, needed anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl himself, who was a Swiss-born solicitor and an atheist, by the way, so the father of Zionism was an atheist. He called himself an atheist. Didn't believe as a Jew at all. Didn't believe in God, didn't believe in the prophet Moses, who had given the Torah to the people of Israel. No, he didn't believe that. Theodor Herzl himself was not afraid to say that, quote, this is a quote, "The anti-Semites will become our surest friends and the anti-Semitic countries our allies," end quote. Precisely because in his time, prejudice against people of Jewish origin was diminishing and the process of assimilation accelerating, it was all the more necessary to emphasize that Jews were different and did not really belong in the countries of their adoption, an opinion in which the anti-Semites heartily concurred. Herzl was warned by a friend, the president of the Austrian parliament, that this emphasis upon the separateness of the Jewish people would eventually bring a bloodbath on Jewry, quote unquote. 50 years later, it was the Holocaust and the sense of guilt prevailing in Europe and the United States, which could have saved so many lives by an open door policy towards Jewish refugees, which it didn't have, that made possible the establishment of the State of Israel. This was made easier by the Palestinians' self-identification as Arabs. It was and still is assumed by many people in the West that this is an identification of their racial origin. In Islam, the term Arab is applied to anyone whose first language is Arabic. This is the correct definition. An Arab is someone for whom their first language, their native language, is Arabic. It's not a racial definition. And hence, if you look in the Arab world, you go places like Lebanon. I've met people who are completely Caucasian, who are Arabs, because perhaps they're descendants of the Crusaders who stayed on or something. But, genetically, you get Caucasians and you get people of different colors and backgrounds, and they're all Arab if they are native speakers of Arabic. It tells us nothing, merely speaking Arabic tells us nothing about a person's ancestry. In fact, the Palestinians are descended from the ancient Canaanites. Now, the Canaanites, of course, are mentioned in the Bible. You'll see it in the Torah. They were the original inhabitants of the land, not the Jews. This is not a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of fact. You just have to read it in the Jewish Bible. There were peoples who inhabited the land of Canaan. And the way the Bible presents it is that they went into the land of Canaan and they literally committed genocide. They wiped out whole population groups, whole nations, whole tribes, targeting specifically men, women, children, and babies. Again, this is not interpretation, this is fact. Look at 1 Samuel 15, the first letter of Samuel, chapter 15 in the Bible. Look it up, Google it. The first several verses specifically targeting for extermination. This is Prophet Samuel allegedly telling Saul to do this. I say allegedly, who knows what history really says, but allegedly commanding Saul, King Saul, the first king of Israel, of course, to commit genocide against the Canaanites. These people, the Palestinians, are descended from these people. And today, of course, Guy Eaton didn't know this, writing in the end of the last century, 1994. Today, we are seeing attempts at genocide or actual mass killings of Palestinians again. And that very text, 1 Samuel 15, has been cited by some Israeli leaders and reference to the Amalekites. Amalek have been made. This is a dog whistle in terms of Jewish kind of history as the enemy of the Jews, and they have to be attacked and killed in this genocidal manner. So as Guy Eaton says, in fact, the Palestinians are descended from the ancient Canaanites, to whose blood, if one must speak in racialist terms, A dozen invading peoples added their quota: Philistines, Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, Persians, Arabs, and Turks, to name but a few. The only point to be made is that the Palestinians are not a people who took possession of the land by force. They were always there. Always there. They were there from the beginning. And this is the great truth, the great truth. And I'm just going to pause there and refer to another book, which I do mention quite often, is this one by the historian, Professor Ilan Pape, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. If you haven't got this book, do get hold of it. This is a meticulous scholarly analysis of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, quoting huge numbers of original archival sources, often Israeli sources that he's dug deep into and found documents go back to the 1940s, which tell a shocking story. And on the back cover, we read this: in 1948, Israeli War of Independence, the 1948 Israeli War of Independence involved one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Around 1 million people were expelled from their homes at gunpoint. Civilians were massacred and hundreds of Palestinian villages destroyed. Denied for almost 6 decades. Had it happened today, and of course it is still happening today, it could only have been called ethnic cleansing. In this groundbreaking book, renowned Israeli historian, yes, he is Israeli, he's Jewish himself, Ilan Pape, offers impressive archival evidence. So he gets primary evidence. This is not theory, politics, this is documented fact. He offers impressive archival evidence to demonstrate that from its very inception, from the beginning, a central plank of Israel's founding ideology, Zionism, was the forcible removal of the indigenous population. Remember the Canaanites? Indigenous population, a strategy that continues to the present day. Dr. Pape's vivid and timely account sheds new light on the origins and development of the Palestine-Israel conflict and is indispensable for anyone interested in the Middle East. And he holds the chair in history at the University of Exeter, and he's author of a number of influential books. So this is the one that I have read, and it is truly shocking to read. So there's the evidence, the historical, documentary, factual evidence going back to 1948 that has been covered up until he wrote that. But to continue finally with Guy Eaton's work. Finally, Muslims, with their first-hand experience of colonialism, can see plainly enough that the notion of settling people from elsewhere in a third world country, as he called it there, we don't call it that anymore, against the wishes of the indigenous inhabitants, could only have arisen in the context of colonialism and as a manifestation of the colonialist mentality. Here again, the public statements of the founding fathers of Zionism seem to them to support this view. The Zionist pioneers were necessarily men of their times. This is in the 19th century, the heyday of colonialism, of course. And their time was, as he says, the high noon of imperialism. They shared with their fellow Europeans a set of values and beliefs which justified and even glorified the colonization of Asia and Africa in the worthy cause of bringing civilization to the natives. So this was the standard view. So it's not kind of some weird Zionist thing at all. This is normative, Western, British, French, and so on, German, whatever, view of their relationship with the world, why they felt that they could acquire colonies, invade, take the wealth of those countries. It was all about civilizing. The French particularly that was the motivator. We wanted to make the Muslims French, of course, and that meant secular. It meant, anyway, a lot of other things. The Zionist pioneers were necessary men of their time, and their time was the high noon of imperialism, and they shared with their fellow Europeans a set of values, and even justify the colonization of Asia and Africa in civilizing the natives. Always said that. It is little wonder, for example, that Aaron Aronson, addressing an audience of French colons in Tunisia in 1909, should have drawn attention to the fact that Jewish immigration into Palestine began in the same year as the French colonization of Tunisia in 1882, and compare the Jewish settler in Palestine to the French settler in Tunisia. So the parallel was there. It was European colonization. For educated Muslims who identify with the Palestinians, and these days it's not just Muslims, it's vast numbers of the population of the world identify with the Muslims and their suffering, the humiliation of being treated as natives who could be pushed aside to make room for white men and women was intensified by the failure of superior Arab forces to dislodge these settlers, so-called settlers. At the very time when Western imperial power was making a discreet withdrawal elsewhere in the world, they were again forced to recognize their own impotence in the face of this power. Humiliation begets rage, and this rage has now sunk deep roots even in the more distant outposts of the Muslim world, most particularly among the young. Turbulent emotions are not easily analyzed, but one has the impression that these young people reserve their most bitter resentment not for the Israelis, but for the Americans. To some extent, they understand that the Israelis act as they themselves might act under similar circumstances. They cannot, however, forgive the nation, but for whose support the state of Israel could not have survived in its present form. That's still true today, but for America vetoing Security Council resolutions and so on, Israel would not have survived in its current form. And of course, America itself is a settler colonial state. Actually, the British and others went to the Native American lands and colonized them and settled there and gradually grew and took over and pushed the inhabitants into reserves, these kind of open prisons where they're forced to live. So America is like Israel, actually. They're both settler, colonial entities. And Britain has done the same in its colonies in Australia, of course. That is a settler colonial power, New Zealand, etc., etc. But this is not the end of the story, says Guy Eaton. It is only the first item on an agenda of victimization to which Muslims believe they have been subjected over the past half-century. Recent events in Kashmir and in India itself figure prominently on this agenda, but there are few areas of the world in which Muslims have not had reason to feel persecuted, because he doesn't mention the Uyghurs in China. It is, however, the conflict in what was formerly Yugoslavia through 1992 to 93 that provided final confirmation of what is commonly seen as a calculated conspiracy. And of course, this is an ethnic genocide, a religious genocide, an anti-Muslim genocide took place in Bosnia. And I was there a couple of months ago and I saw evidence of that in an extraordinary museum in Sarajevo to the genocide of the Bosnian Muslims. These were white European Muslims who were nonetheless genocided by the Christians, the Orthodox Christians in Europe. So there has been a genocide after World War II in Europe. Most Europeans have no idea about it, though, even though it's extremely well documented and is acknowledged to have been a genocide by many legal authorities, including the United Nations and so on. Facts are always open to dispute, he says, but there can be no dispute regarding what people believe to be the facts, and this is what counts. Prior to 1992, those who claimed that Europe and the United States were set upon a new crusade to destroy Islam and enslave the Muslims were a minority and might be considered marginal. Without counting heads, which is impossible, it appears that they may now be in a majority. And so it continues. I'll probably leave it there. Islam and the Destiny of Man by Guy Eaton, and The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilham Pape. Both extraordinary books, very different books. One written by an English Muslim, the other written by an Israeli living in England. And there we have it. The story continues. It's just got worse. The situation, recent events, the genocide is continuing, the killing of Palestinian leader assassination, and Israel's invasion of Lebanon and other places, and the threat of world war looms as well. But yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts about Palestine, about Gaza, about the West, particularly, who bears complete responsibility for what's happening, because they could stop it immediately if they wished, but they don't want to. They're continuing supplying arms and diplomatic cover and everything else to this settler colonial entity in the Muslim world. And I suppose I ought to say, because it's true, that a significant number of Palestinians are Christians as well. They're not just Muslims. They too have equally suffered, and their experience of dispossession and oppression is completely ignored by Christians in the West, as far as I can see. I don't remember any Christians in America getting up in arms about the suffering of Palestinian Christians in the occupied territories. They ignore them, and they side with the Israelis, who are not Christians, many of whom are atheists as well. So it's a very strange world indeed. Let me know your thoughts. Until next time.